Welcome to Bold Agendas, the podcast where we explore topics of strategic interest to business leaders who are guiding their organizations through transformative change. As we close out 2025, one thing is clear. This has been a year of acceleration, the year when digital transformation grew up. We saw the promises of AI tested against operational reality. We watched composable enterprises take shape. Governance, trust, and resilience move from the periphery of strategy to the center of it. And in the process, leaders everywhere confronted a new truth. Transformation is no longer a destination, it's a continuous state of becoming. Across industries, organizations were pushed to evolve faster than their structures, faster than their processes, and sometimes faster than their own sense of readiness. Strategy itself began to change from something we planned to something we practiced in real time. As we look back on what 2025 taught us and ahead to what 2026 may demand, I couldn't imagine a better guest to help us make sense of it all than Frank Diana. Frank is a global futurist, a thought leader, and a managing partner at TCS, where he helps organizations reimagine their future through systems thinking and scenario-based foresight. His work explores how technology, society, and business converge to shape what's next, and how leaders can build the strategic capacity to adapt in an age of acceleration. I'm Mimi Brooks, and this is Bold Agendas, Acceleration as the New Normal, Lessons from 2025 and the New Road Ahead. Let's get started. Welcome, Frank. Thank you so much for joining me on this, interesting end of year Bold Agendas, kind of a look back and a look ahead. So there's no one I'd rather be doing this with than you. So thanks for making time, especially right before the holidays.
Always a pleasure to join you.
I feel like I've chased you around the world this year, Frank. So I'm glad I didn't have to chase you out of New Jersey today.
Not today. Not today.
Not today. Tomorrow, but not today. Okay, let's go ahead and jump in. Frank, it's been an interesting year, right? This past year, a lot of maturity. I think a lot of lessons learned. In terms of where we started at the beginning of the year, and perhaps some of the things that we learned as we start wrapping up this year. So why don't we start with that? Why don't we start with, in your experience, and you touch a lot of companies, work with a lot of different organizations. What do you think were the big movements in 25 lessons learned, or any other ideas that you think might have advanced maturity around business transformation?
The interesting one to me is acceptance. When you talk about where the world may be going, and in years past, that conversation tended to be accepted at a level in terms of maybe, this is not going to happen for several years, I'm not going to worry about it. But I think the shift that I've seen in the last year is much more acceptance that we better start paying attention. There's more urgency around the conversations. Where's the world going? There's more compelling reasons to act. And really, it was a struggle of mine for years just to get people to pay attention to these forces that are at work and what they might mean to businesses, their journeys, their transformation journeys, et cetera. So the big one for me was acceptance. The others were already sort of in play, but I think I'm more acute in 2025, those being the acceleration factor, which is really a symptom, not a cause. We can get into that. The levels of uncertainty raising exponentially, if you will, and just the sheer complexity of our world. I think those three things were prominent in the last year.
I think that accelerating is a common theme from 25. I saw that as well. So what do you mean when you say that, Frank? How do you think that affected business leaders' point of view, and even how they might have taken action this past year?
Well, the point of view, I think the appreciation that we're living in times where nothing remains very static for very long is clearly appreciated. Struggles at the leadership level around, even if you make a decision, how long lasting is that decision given the pace phenomena, right? So I've had so many leaders say to me, well, we can make a bet here, but How certain can we be that it's even in a month's time? It's a valid bet, right? So I think the appreciation that um, this notion of adaptability, which we've talked about for years, this growing word resilience that now many people talk about, has really taken root in terms of how people think, how leaders are thinking today, and appreciate the fact that if things are going to move constantly, then the frameworks, the foundations of our businesses have to change to really move with where the world moves.
I think that's an interesting point, Frank, because I agree with you. We've been talking adaptation versus adoption for for a few years now. So it's good to see that kind of behavioral change, leadership behavioral change. I think along with adaptation, you tell me what you think. Is this idea of adapting our systems, like adapting what? Adapting our systems. And I think that brings in another important point of view because we've been talking about the organizational systems and structures at play here in terms of what needs to evolve and what needs to change. So I think the idea of a systemic approach and the concept of adaptation, how through systems, that are themselves, dynamic and adaptive. Your thought?
So when we talk systems, obviously focus on organizations and helping at a system level. But when I talk system, it's more civilizational systems because the changes occurring at our civilizational level is really the macro level issue. Everything falls down from there, right? So our organizational systems are trying to react to the civilizational systems that are changing. So when I say that, I mean societal systems, economic systems, geopolitical systems. And so I think the predominant force is the convergence that's occurring across domains that is forcing systemic change at that macro level. And as it ripples into organizations and leaders, the struggle now is how to adapt to the changes that are happening above our organizations, if you will.
And how to be able to adapt continuously, right, Frank? I mean, that's the idea, not adapting one time or occasionally, but adapting, as a matter of capability.
Yeah, it's perpetual. It's clearly a perpetual
Yeah.
process now, right? You
Yeah.
can't just make one shift and think we're done. And I think again that starts at the systemic level. I like that word a lot because I think in our times when systemically everything's changing, if you don't view it systemically, then you really can't adapt. You can't be resilient.
So, what do you think, Frank? Businesses that you interacted with, those that progressed well, maybe even better than others over the past year, what do you think that they did right in their journey that perhaps others might not have been as quick to adopt in terms of approach or idea?
I think it starts with being open-minded. The challenge and the struggle I referenced before that I've been having is just a unwillingness to accept that the things we believe, the things that have made us successful in the past, really don't help us anymore going forward. If you don't let go of some of those things, then it's really hard as a leader, as an organization, to adapt because you're really kind of stuck in a mode of operating that just doesn't work in a world that looks very different. So first and foremost, those that do it well um, are accepting of changing in belief systems and simple things like letting go of command and control and hierarchical structures, right? Those are simple things, but very hard to let go of because they dominated how we lead, how we organize. So I think those that do it really well, I know those that do it really well are those that really keep that open mind, accept that things are changing at a level we haven't seen in a very long time. And through that acceptance, have been successful, at least in navigating these waters.
Besides leadership, Frank, what do you think companies that navigated well did in terms of engaging the workforce? Like, what did you see that was done that, from your perspective, was particularly, novel or effective in terms of how we think about this idea of, change that's inclusive of everyone's contributions?
Yeah. So making change, making people a part of the change process, right? So accepting that what's happening, and if we just view this through the lens of AI, for example, what's happening with AI is going to impact everybody in an organization, not just leaders, but clearly the people of that organization. And so as change occurs, it's change management 101. If people aren't part of that change process, then the chances of succeeding are pretty small. And so those that are successful are those that really understand the notion of everybody being part of the change process. And so one, it affects everyone. And two, the ideas that people will bring to the table. This notion of collective intelligence, if you will, that collective intelligence will help in times where we need to think differently, but nobody has the right answer. Nobody has every answer, right? We need everybody to participate in this. And interestingly, AI is something, a mechanism, if you will, that actually helps us gather all that collective intelligence, if you will.
Any lessons learned, Frank, that that you saw this past year that you would say, would be ideas that, would want to be able to move decidedly from as we go into 26? So missteps that you feel like lessons learned, we should set that one down and put it in the books and move on from there.
Yeah, well, a key lesson learned is, we've talked about adaptability. Well, governance and policy and guide and guardrails, all the things we've talked about over the last several years, and the fact that everything's outpacing our capacity to do those things. So the key lesson learned that I've seen is that adaptable governance is critical. And so learning on the fly, and I'll give you a great example. I was with the leaders of a smart city initiative very recently, and these sandboxes, these policy sandboxes, where they take the rules out, they basically open it up to experimentation around policy and regulation. And through that experimentation, start to kind of move themselves forward in a more rapid fashion, as opposed to catching up all the time because of the pace that we talked about earlier. So one of the keys, and I think those that are doing this well, are embracing this notion of adaptable governance and these sandboxes that allow them to experiment with policy decisions, using things like digital twins that let them simulate those decisions and policies in ways that helps understand impact before they actually get implemented. So lots of things that people can do, simulation being a really big one. That's a key lesson learned for me.
I think simulation, that's a great point, Frank. I think simulation was a big theme this past year, that people started picking up on the real value of simulation and learning before we put anything into reality. And the idea that that is applicable to the organization itself, how the organization decisions, how it learns, how leaders are likely, to hedge bets and make decisions going forward. So this whole phenomena of digital twin organizations, DTOs, if you will, did you hear that, Frank, in your discussions with businesses this past year in terms of how they might be looking to simulate going forward? Like, how do you think they'll take that capability and apply it in terms of areas of most interest to them?
Well, there's two ways to look at this. There's the simulation digital twin phenomena in the context of their external customers and their business, and how they apply them in ways that actually help the bottom line, help growth, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the internal application of simulation and digital twins, and both are going to be effective. I wouldn't say that it's widespread in terms of its use today, but definitely growing in use. And internally, you made the point in terms of decisions, and I talked earlier about how the decisions today could look foolish just a month down the road, right? That makes simulation that much more critical. I mean, if you simulate and you start to look at pathways where things may go, with some degree of plausibility, some degree of confidence, although we know it's hard to do that these days, but simulation helps, right? So simulating anything in the context of decision making is going to help make those decisions a little more effective going forward. And the better we get at this, the more data, and think about the sensors of our world, the places where data is going to enter these simulations. And if you consider how much more data we'll have at our disposal, that's going to make every simulation more effective over time. So starting now is better than starting later.
Do you think that those strategies are starting to take hold, Frank, in businesses? Are you seeing the investments in these infrastructures and ecosystems relative to the future intelligence of the organization? Is that at all chips on the table from what you're seeing, or how do you see leadership teams dealing with that issue?
Sporadically, these things tend to take some time to really take root, because they're unknowns for the most part, there are new ways of thinking, new ways of doing business. And so you have to expect some degree of lag before these things really become commonplace in businesses today. So I wouldn't say it's there yet. But I do believe, as we said earlier, that um, people are starting to pay attention. I think this notion of change being constant and fast has really taken root. And I've taken heart. I think we might have talked offline about this in some of our recent sessions where some of the approaches I've used in the strategy framework you mentioned are getting leaders to actually talk in the context of actions as opposed to thinking is too far off for me to worry about. And that was the big dilemma, right? If you think this is science fiction, if you think this is too far in the future to be concerned about, then the likelihood of you taking action is small. But that seems to be changing. And so I think that little subtle movement towards acceptance will, I think, lead to more use of these things in the future.
Let's go into the strategy framework, because what we've seen changing, and interested if you're seeing it as well, is whether the sense of urgency has been there, that this is something that we really need to start spending money, time, and executive attention on. I think we're there. And now I think the question is, what does strategy here look like? What's an effective way to think about strategy? And so I kind of think about that as an evolutionary idea. Frank, you and I have been talking about strategy for years, and it almost seems like this framework that you've been using this past year, I'm going to let you kind of describe that to our folks, is a natural evolution of where you've been. There's, rehearsing the future ideas to it. There's strategic foresight ideas to it. But it seems like, a broader, more comprehensive system point of view now relative to how we think about the factors of anticipating the possibilities going forward. So why don't I let you kind of describe what you've been doing with businesses and how you think about this as a reusable framework?
You use the key word there, anticipating. And although I've historically used the notion of sense and respond consistently over the years, it feels too reactive to me. It almost has the sense that you sense something and then you react or respond. Whereas anticipating and influencing are very different things. So we can anticipate and then influence outcomes. That's a much better place to be than sensing and then responding. So this notion of strategy, which is planning and creating these strategies, is antiquated. And I'd like to think about strategy going forward in the context of continuous sense making. So that continuous process of making sense out of our world. And through that process, anticipating pathways leads us to at least actionable things that might influence an outcome. So that notion of pathways is where this framework that you referenced started. The possibilities of our world are endless. And, it came to a realization a long time ago that we've never been here before, where the possibility space is so broad that traditional scenario planning just doesn't work. You can't possibly account for all the scenarios that are emerging. At the root of all this is the fact that the 7 foundational domains of civilization, and we've talked about this: science, technology, society, geopolitics, economics, philosophy, and environment, are all in a state of flux for the first time ever. We've never been here before. And the acceleration and speed phenomena that we all experience is a symptom of that phenomena. The feedback loops across these domains are so intense that what happens in one amplifies something in another, and it's happening across 7 of them. So it's not surprising that we're experiencing what we're experiencing. So how does one think about scenarios in a world that looks like this? And so the notion of moving from scenario planning to this pathway phenomena. What if we could understand the pathways of a given theme? If it's mobility or energy, even fertility and cognitive decline. These are all things that you can form pathways around, a series of pathways that give you a plausible look into where they might go. And the difference between this kind of mechanism and traditional approaches is the progression of the forces that show you how that pathway plays out, and a temporal analysis where some degree of timing is built in. And so what I have found in terms of the reactions of audiences that I have used this with is exactly that. It's the progression that really gets them to see that aha moment, and the temporal analysis where it now brings you into, it's not science fiction in 50 years from now. It's likely to happen in the next 5 years. And so how does a pathway analysis inform us from a sense-making perspective, and how does that inform our strategies, which is a continuous process?
So, Frank, I think that what I'll do is have you send me a visual that I can put up for the podcast to make some of the structure of your framework real. I think it would be helpful. So let's talk as if I have that, because I think there's a lot of connecting dots through this framework, that make the framework, make sense, because it literally is this kind of compounding effect, right? Starting with the 7 key domains. And that goes back to the comment that you made at the beginning of, our discussion, right, Frank? When you said, look, when I think of systems, I think of mega systems. I think of the big systems that, are being affected here, political systems, social systems, et cetera, et cetera. That's what you're pointing to. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in your framework, you're suggesting that we can identify these, different possibility chains. I believe that's your language, possibility chains. And we can do that by anticipating how issues roll across these different domains, and then try to understand the impact and pressure points that they have on each, and even together. If this, then that, then this, then that, because they kind of build on each other. Yeah. And in the process, right, Frank, it must, when you're working this with senior leadership teams, create a plausibility almost to, the potential futures that they might need to consider, right? So there's a grounding idea in terms of we create plausible outcomes here, from these different interrogations of what if across domains, pressure points, et cetera. Does it make it more real for leaders from your perspective in terms of being able to engage in this?
Yeah, everything is exactly right. And so just a great example, on a board session several months ago, I used one of these possibility chains. I actually focused on fertility decline, which really ripples into everything. It's a great example of how that one theme and all the forces it spawns ripples into everything, right? And so when you use something like that, you can see this phenomena of forces across domains actually connecting. But you wouldn't actually go there without something kind of priming that pump, right? Showing you that these things are all starting to diverge across these domains. And it was really telling in the Q&A and discussion that followed my keynote. The discussion centered on actioning one of the pathways. The pathway was really ending in an outcome that looked like a severe case of inequality amplified in our world, which is already a problem, but it gets even worse. And the discussion, it was a big investment fund. The discussion centered on their capacity to use their investments to drive different outcomes, attack the problem of inequality, right? And so when you start to see that kind of progression and series of forces drive somebody to say, haha, if we kind of take these steps, we can avert this kind of outcome. And that really was the intent. Discussions that I was having before were good conversations, but I never felt like there was going to be any action taken afterwards. Now, I feel like this process is leading people to the aha moments and focusing on actionability. And I had the same conversation recently in the Middle East with another smart city agenda, same kind of conversation, right? Focusing on this gives us the capacity to action something, whereas scenarios don't really get you there. It shows you where you might go, but the pathway to it doesn't exist. So you have no capacity to really action.
Yeah, it's, not just capacity too, right, Frank, but choice, because now I can think about, where I really want to have an impact or influence. So it gives me an opportunity to look at that, that pathway, that system of impact, and decide, based on our purpose, our priorities, where we might want to play. And if so, how so?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And systems thinking, critical thinking are all kinds of words we use to kind of capture what's needed here. But when you can actually see connections that aren't actually very visible until you show it this way, that systems thinking is supported now by some tangible things. So for example, and a good example I use a lot in these keynotes is extreme events. Right, the extreme event phenomenon is happening around the world. Nobody believes it's going to reverse. And so we're going to deal with a lot of extreme events. And so when I show the extreme event piece, I then use a video. And the video shows a digital twin of a grandmother in her kitchen actually helping her granddaughter cook a recipe that she loved. She's gone, but the digital twin has captured everything she did, even her mannerisms. And it's really impactful to hold on to tradition and culture through some mechanism like that. Then I'll ask an audience, what does that have to do with extreme events? And really the exercise there is to connect a couple dots. Extreme events will lead to migratory patterns, both internal to a country and across borders, because people can no longer stay where they've been because of the events, whether it's flooding, et cetera, et cetera. And so as that movement occurs, the loss of culture, the loss of heritage, the loss of tradition is really an acute problem. And so these mechanisms where approaches like digital twins to hold on to a culture, a city that basically in the tourism or for their own people builds culture right in. The building that you pass tells you all about its history. I mean, think about what might have to happen just to address a scenario like that, right? Those dots wouldn't connect otherwise unless we actually physically connect them.
So, Frank, what do you think, aside from, the opportunities that you have to keynote boards and leadership teams, how do you want them to take this framework forward relative to their real strategic and operational planning process of the business? So aside from like the initial, value of relatedness, convergence, thinking about, how the dots all connect as a means of being able to create opportunity and impact, or at least clarity around it. What do you want them to do as they go back to their day jobs? What do they do with this?
So a couple examples. I recently did a session in the mobility space, which I believe, I use the word ambient a lot. Ambient mobility means it's just part of the fabric of society, or ambient energy, ambient learning. It's just all part of the fabric of society. In that session, and in most sessions, I position 25 pathways. It's really hard to do much more than that. And I drill in on 5 or 6. And so the reaction has been, I'd like to take this pathway and flesh it out. Let's go deeper underneath the forces that I show, because I can only show so much. So I show forces that span 2025 through 2030, and how they build the causal relationships between the forces to a potential end state in 2030. And so to your point, if you want to understand where you might go as a business strategically, growth platform, et cetera, what if you play that pathway out? Really drill into the plausibility of those forces, and then not make a bet on, but maybe pursue one of them and constantly iterate, constantly try to make sense of where that pathway is going. So you'd shift as you need to shift. But that's really what I'm hearing, is this potential to take pathways into strategy, and new businesses or growth, opportunities in existing business,
Yeah.
right? Those are all potential uses of this kind of frame.
So, Frank, that if I hear that right, I feel like what you're saying is it's an and idea. I can take this as a framework, isolate a few critical pathways that I've decided I have a strong interest in. I can do whatever planning process I might normally do from a strategy perspective. But if I want to bring in a couple of these pathways and ask the question, what if we, tried to influence, intercede, contribute, whatever the question is, that I can bring that in. The nice thing about what I think you're saying is that it sounds like this transformation period that's under interrogation or consideration is a fixed 5-year period. So we're not talking about 15 years out. We're talking about 5 years, which is probably about the tolerance of most boards and executive teams in terms of, running a transition plan. Is that how you think about it, Frank, in terms of the 5-year window you're talking about?
Yeah, and interesting, the genesis of this frame was a board meeting where they wanted to focus just 18 months out. And my pushback was that you're allowing the future to define you versus the other way around. But unless you can show that, right, those are just words. And so what I end up doing for that specific session is putting up a picture that has a big model of all these forces across these 7 domains, and I blank out the middle. So all you see visible is 2025 and 2030. And so if you ignore the middle, you're basically resigning yourself to potentially living in that 2030 world because you've done nothing to influence his path, right? So it works because again, it's not just words. You're showing it's plausible that 2030 looks like this. right? And so it's, I think what's worked the best, to your point, where boards really, they don't want to look too far out. They want to look closer in. And the other big piece of that story is, well, define too far out for me, because we just talked about how fast things are moving, right? And so I like to talk about 5 years out being sort of just a target, but who knows what that looks like. And the other piece, the reason for, on the 5, I long believed that the back end of this decade was going to be massively transformative for the world and not just business. I still believe that. Nothing I've seen in the last 10 to 15 years of doing this changes my mind. And so if that is true, speculative, but if it's true, then we better focus on the next 5 years. And that's really why I do so.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. So Frank, if I just looked at this through a different lens, like a different door to the same party, what do you think the takeaways here are in terms of leadership changes as blah, 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 to blah, 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 the effect on workers shifts from this to that, and culture means what as we navigate these waters?
Well, we'll start with leadership. And I'll come back to a phrase I just like, and that is sense making. I really do believe that, and then you use this term, I'll use it here because I think it works, orchestration. If you think about leadership in through the lens of a world that has to be orchestrated, right? If there is so much dynamism in the world across these domains, then not just sense making, but orchestration has to happen. And so really, these forces that I keep talking about need to be orchestrated. So one of the key leadership traits going forward, system thinking is obviously one of them, but that orchestrators, really not command and control dictators, not the kinds of things that we are accustomed to in the past, but orchestrators. And so I think it's a key leadership skill going forward, and desperately needed in a world that has just so much going on, and organizations as well. I mean, culturally, the cultural shift that I think is critical, because it's not just leaders that have the challenge, because we are all humans, by the way. We are all stubborn species. We're a stubborn species that doesn't like change. So culturally, embracing this notion of change, hard for us to do as humans, and allowing ourselves to unlearn, which I know I've used a lot, but letting go, big challenge, but letting go of things that we just believe or have made us successful in the past, but might not be right for our times. Culturally, that has to happen. So it's a significant change management problem, I believe. I'm not sure traditional change management approaches work here. And maybe there's a kind of rethink around even change management, if you will, as we think about this world of ours. But that's critical. And at the people level, resistance is futile. I've always said that. And so we should embrace individually, as employees, the world that's emerging. And people saying that AI won't replace your job, but those that use it more effectively will, right? That kind of phenomenon where we'll embrace what's coming, leverage it in ways that make us more effective, amplify our skill sets, and constantly learning, right? I mean, we have to, as leaders, as individuals, constantly learn. Those are all the things I think about in terms of your question.
One of the stubborn ones, Frank, just hang there for 1 minute, I think is this idea of growing a culture of experimentation. That's really an anti-pattern to a lot of cultural norms and organizations, particularly large organizations, and just the basic ideas of that. We're experimenting. We're not deciding yet. We're happy with whatever the lessons learned are here. We just want to learn them fast, and we want to figure out how to apply them better the next time. That whole concept, and all of the, norms, reward systems, everything else that goes along with experiment and let the cards fall where they fall, because we're all learning and we can move forward together, a lot more informed than what we were before. That whole culture of experimentation is kind of interesting. Your thoughts?
Well, I'll say it this way. Those that accelerate their learning will succeed. And accelerating learning could happen in a number of different ways, right? Experimentation is a great way to do that. And using simulation and other approaches to aid our experimentation, obviously, is a great marriage. But there's other ways to expand the capacity to learn. For example, you and I have talked about ecosystems for years. operating in an ecosystem that is very diverse, that is not strictly, our company or our supply chain or our value chain, but a broader ecosystem represents an opportunity to learn on an accelerated level. And so I've long believed that diversity of thought, providing us platforms to drive that diversity, ecosystem being one of them, as a mechanism to accelerate learning. So it's a great point in terms of experimentation, but I would elevate that to a broader category of accelerated learning, with experimentation just being one of the mechanisms.
Yeah, I think you're making a great point that, the multiple doors into continuous learning, continuous improvement, continuous learning it's a huge opportunity for everybody. And I think critical in terms of, worker adaptation for sure. Anything else, Frank, that you want to get on the table in terms of the strategy framework itself, before we move on, any key ideas that we might have missed?
I just want to kind of underscore the one key point to all this, and that is, I call it possibility chains because of the breadth of possibilities that we have in front of us. But the key there is that the intersection of forces across these domains are happening. They're colliding, if you will, and they're doing so outside of our vantage point, if you will. If you look back to the most impactful period in human history, which was really the 1870s to the 1970s, if you look back retrospectively, you see that same level of convergence, some level of convergence happening. But if you lived in those times, you never would have seen it happening. And we're there again, right? It's happening, but we don't see it unless we truly focus on it. So the core of this framework was the attempt to look at the intersections and really show those intersections so that they're visible. And through that visibility, some form of actionability emerges. And that's the core of this message.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And as you said, Frank, it's kind of interesting, right? We've been talking about convergence for a long time as well, even early on from a technology perspective, when we would say, the pace of change is exponential and combinatorial. And now I think, this convergence idea is another way of saying the same thing relative to the impact across all domains, right? The exception of none.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
Yeah.
interesting. Just a side note, I've tried to quantify this, and I actually have a framework or a set of metrics to quantify it. But there have been 5 ages throughout human history that have represented systemic change, or move from one to the other, which was systemic and in terms of change. We went from hunter and gatherer to agriculture, from agriculture to the axial age, from the axial age to Renaissance, and then into industrial age. And you can score, and I scored the level of activation of each domain, the 7 domains that drove each. And it went from low level of activation to very high level of activation through the industrial era. And in this era, which I'm calling the biointelligent era, we're almost at a max score in terms of level of activation. It's more complex than I can get into right now, but I've actually tried to quantify how this phenomenon of convergence has actually driven the systemic shifts throughout history, and how we're at a place where the chaos level is at an extreme high because of that level of activation.
Frank, just one question before we leave this and start looking ahead to 26. I'm curious, when you're meeting with leadership teams, particularly the global leadership discussions that you have, how does this framework, how does this perspective impact leadership teams as they think about purpose and the real idea of operationalizing purpose? So I'm just wondering if you can kind of connect the dots to that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And really the reason why if I can, always use human-centric pathways in my keynotes. I could talk about things like energy and mobility, and I have. But if I have the ability to use things like fertility decline or cognitive decline, or even aging or the fall of working age population, those are human-centric things. And what I find is, because it connects to everybody at the human level, the reaction is stronger. And to your point, the purpose orientation becomes or the need for becomes much more real. That notion of inequality that I mentioned at that one board discussion, when it becomes very real, I think you start to see more of a willingness to focus on this purpose orientation. But But I'll caution that we've been here for a while, whether we call it purpose or stakeholder capitalism or whatever the words are. We still have not done a whole lot outside of CSR initiatives, et cetera. I still think we have ways to go.
It's interesting that I just want to point to this, Frank, because I wasn't following this idea until you said it explicitly, that the pathways, that your preference is that those pathways are human-centric in nature, so that, again, there's a high degree of resonating. If everybody can resonate with these, right, as we think about how they move through, these domains affecting kind of everybody and everything. That's an interesting point to me. Also, Frank, I wonder whether, just to hang on purpose for 1 second longer, is, sometimes I think the problem with purpose is that it's just not terribly differentiating, that it ends up being, statements, obvious statements, value statements, et cetera. But, they often don't really get to the heart of the business. And one of the things that I would hope in the framework and in the discussions that you're having, especially if we think about things in terms of human-centric pathways, is that we can think of, purpose that matters, purpose that means something in terms of decisions that we make and priorities that we set and lines we don't cross, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Your thoughts?
Yeah. I don't think we're ever going to move away from a profit motive, but given the capacity we have today to solve some of our grandest challenges, and I really do believe we have that capacity. I show videos that really just make the point really clear. We can do some great things, which means that the alignment of a profit motive with purpose is strong, because if businesses can grow on the back of solving some of these great challenges, then both are accomplished. Right. And so I think we live in times where we can do both. Purpose doesn't have to be just window dressing. Purpose can be something that drives our businesses and solves problems. And I do think we're going to see more of that. When synthetic biology starts to take off the way I believe it will, and the capacity to solve and create others, solve problems, create some others, I think you'll see more of that purpose orientation emerge.
Well, and let me say too, Frank, to your point, sustainable purpose, I think just doesn't happen unless it works hand in hand with a growth strategy. So it all sounds good, but it doesn't matter because, the dog's not going to hunt whatever way you want to describe it. So, but I think it's an opportunity, as you said, for purpose to mean something relative to, the impact that the business is trying to have and all of the outcomes that they would want. So that'll be interesting to see how that unfolds.
Want to take one? Okay. Want to take one example?
Yeah, go ahead.
We'll go back to the fertility conversation.
Yeah.
It is a decline globally where we're having fewer children around the world, but there are those that would love to have children but can't. And so from a technology perspective, there are a number of things emerging that can solve that problem in terms of, and some of that is very sci-fi, but real, but could challenge our ethics and our morals at some level as we move forward. But that aside, there are places in the world that are looking to monetize that, right? If I could monetize the capacity to allow people to have children, it's a growth engine and it's going to happen, right? But that's a great example of that connection between profit and purpose.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Frank, before I leave this, I just want to make sure that I get this from you in case there's something here. So your work this past year in particular seems to be quite wide globally. I'm just wondering whether you see any interesting variability in the audiences that you speak with as you travel the globe. Anything that, strikes you as something that, you might not have expected or that you found interesting in the global context?
I won't say that it was unexpected, because I think you just have to watch the news these days and know that the embrace of ESG, the embrace of sustainability is definitely very intense in places around the world like Asia and Europe, not as intense in the US specifically, right? So that's just one example of variability around the world. And so it's just interesting when I do travel the way I do and have these discussions in various global audiences, just the differences in how some of these things are viewed. It's telling, but at the same time, it's very interesting.
Yeah. Not necessarily surprising, but interesting how it trickles down, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So year ahead, What do you think is on the table for us, Frank, going forward? What do you think we'll find interesting, or things that might move faster than expected, or other ideas of sustainable change that might come as we go into the new year?
So a couple of things. One obviously is everybody's going to be watching artificial intelligence, because this notion of artificial general intelligence, while I find it distracting, just keeps getting a lot of attention. And there are some that believe that 2026 is the year where we'll have realized that, which really fundamentally means that we'll go from the narrow application of AI to very general application, which means an AI can really attack anything that humans can. Whether that happens in 26 or not, there's a body of evidence that would suggest it could happen in 26. So one key thing to focus on is just how far artificial intelligence goes. And then, of course, what that means, not just for business, but for society. So that's one pathway. The other, which is related, is just how far humanoid robots have advanced in the last 2 years. And I credit artificial, well, let's call it generative AI, for that, some of that advancement. Dexterity was always a problem. We're overcoming some of those issues, but situational awareness, that robot knowing its environment, was critically important. And now with generative AI built into these robots and the use of large behavior models, which really mimic what humans do and allow robots to just do what we do in various settings, in various contexts, is something that I expect to really be front and center next year. I think you're going to see some things that are going to fascinate people from a robot's perspective. So that's the other one. And then I'm hopeful, but not quite sure yet if synthetic biology starts to get a little more attention next year, because really, genetic engineering and the kinds of things that biotech are likely to bring. I really do think when it's all said and done, it's the most impactful of these big technologies we talk about because of its capacity to alter and impact human life or other forms of life. And so I think we'll start to see a little bit more headlines in the context of synthetic biology next year. At least I hope, because I think it needs a lot of attention, and it doesn't get the
What
attention.
about policy, Frank? What do you think might be focuses from a policy perspective as we, move forward with AI and other issues of governance?
So I mentioned this before. I think this notion of adaptive governance is already being played out in parts around the world, where these policy sandboxes are being stood up, freed from the environments that would kind of keep them from moving with speed, and then experimenting, to your word that you used earlier, right? So I think the policy environment, in places that are open to this kind of approach, experimenting in sandboxes, is a phenomenon that you'll see more next year. But interestingly, and I've run across this, the actual discussion in places around the world. There are places that want to export the policies that they actually come up with in these sandboxes. So really being the platform for experimentation, and then that platform is used to export, maybe even monetize policy, right, as a growth strategy for a nation. So policy has to speed up, because we're at that place where things are moving too fast for policy and regulation to really keep up. So that has to happen. That, to me, let's not get into the specific policy conversations. Let's figure out how to get them done quicker.
Yeah, but I think this idea, interestingly, of the opportunities of policy is a pretty interesting idea too, relative to, differentiating parts of the world and, what capabilities, services, economies they might be offering there. Kind of interesting.
Yeah, at the nation level, right? We're not talking business.
Yeah.
We're talking about
Yeah.
experiments going on at the nation level that might provide a platform for export.
That's right.
It's interesting.
Exactly. Yeah, very interesting. What do you think about organizations going forward? And, Frank, we've been talking about this for a while, but I'm not sure that we've really operationalized it in too many places. And that is, this idea of, composability of organizations, how we think about teams and process, and capabilities being, composable so that they can, be redirected and shifted across the organization to priorities that, create a dynamic response in terms of the organizational, structure or capabilities that defy our prior hierarchies, and gets into the command and control approach that you were talking about before. So clearly a long-standing concern about hierarchy scaling, but not a lot of models, I think, of real implementation of new organizational structures. Your thoughts?
Well, it stifles the current model stifle innovation, number one, right? Because the core of the business is always the focus, as it should be, but innovation doesn't do very well in that context. So that composability notion, or this notion of micro enterprises, which I know you were looking at as well, it's not new in the sense that somebody's doing it. I mean, if you're familiar with Haier, Haier, the Chinese company, with over 5,000 of these micro enterprises, and using the services of the core on a contract basis just when needed as a support for ventures they take into the market and explore and experiment with. It's proven to have been a significant growth engine for the company, and the model has been talked about for several years now, as a model to be emulated. Now the question, because I think it's really spot on, and it really describes that composability notion that you talked about. The question is how many enterprises have embraced that? I know of a couple, but it really speaks to how hard it is for enterprises to embrace something completely different, right? I mean, that is completely different in terms of how you manage and the freedom and autonomy you give these micro enterprises to go and explore, and maybe even get a venture capitalist to support their enterprise. There's all kinds of things that can be done.
Yeah,
right. So
that'll be an interesting one to watch. At some point, that giant's got to fall, Frank. The hierarchical organization structure has got to fall, because it's not going to help us too much, in its current form. By the way, I wanted to tell you, this is so funny. This morning, I was up early watching Bloomberg, and was thinking about our talk later on today, and they came out with a news flash saying that Waymo robo taxis have hit the U.S. highways before Tesla, kind of scooping Tesla in terms of robo taxis. And I thought, I'm going to make a note of that, because Frank's going to say something about robotics during the course of the discussion. I'm like, yeah, I got to make sure I tell him that in case he didn't see it.
But
So that was pretty.
That's a great example, though, of something that people believe would happen sooner, right? Right.
Yes.
Think about the 2014, 15. I mean, the big discussion was, and I remember talking to insurance executives about their premium base, what was going to happen, right? And here we are, like 10 years later. And yes, it's a phenomena, and it's happening in different contexts all around the world, whether it's the factory or the mines with autonomous trucks, et cetera. So it is happening, but not on the streets of various cities. So if you were somebody that wanted to place a bet on autonomous vehicles back then, you probably ended up losing a bunch of money. So the question leaders would ask today is, well, how can I assure that this pathway that you suggest isn't going to end up in the same place, right? I mean, that's the phenomena that we're dealing with.
Yeah, exactly. So, Frank, kind of parting thoughts, like what would you leave behind looking ahead, kind of knowing what you know and learning what you've learned over the past year? What do you think, might be some advice to leaders as they think about, planning their priorities and big bets this year? What advice would you give?
I think I'll start where I began, and that is acceptance. Acceptance of what's happening across the world, across these domains. I mean, the tendency to think through the lens of technology is a strong tendency. So I find that, AI and other technologies dominate conversation, and what we're not focusing on is some of the societal things that we were talking about before, the key differences geopolitically in our world today, which hasn't really been in place for several decades. Right. So it's just kind of not just acceptance, but expanding our vision, right? Allowing ourselves to think and view things a little more broadly are critically important, as we think about the world that's emerging. And as I mentioned a couple times, this notion of systemic change and therefore viewing things systemically is something that we all need to do, not just leaders of the world, but us as individuals. And I just appreciate that things are going to change. And that's the hardest part, right? And no matter who I talk to, personally or in business, it's a struggle to accept that we do need to unlearn. I'll leave it with that, right? Unlearning tough for humans to do, critical in our times.
It's amazing too, Frank, right? How you could still say sense making as a capability going forward, even though we've been talking about it for years and the context of it has changed clearly. Sometimes I'll call it mega sense making just to try to put it into today's context. But it really is amazing, how some of those ideas and personal assets, really still hold a lot of value, a lot of water going forward.
More so now than ever. Sense making and meaning making, right? Finding meaning in things. It's interesting because I talk a lot about learning and education, and I do have this vision for a world where learning is ambient, right? We're surrounded by the platform to learn, whether it's, as I mentioned before, a building talking to us, or a hologram of Einstein helping us learn something. Right? All those things would become very ambient and surround us. And so the notion of memorization in the context of learning, right? The educational institutions of our day are very antiquated, and memorization of facts is key. Well, in a world where any fact you ever wanted is really right there at your fingertips, memorization stops being a scarcity, right? And so what becomes the scarcity of tomorrow? Well, it's going to be sense making and meaning making. That's going to be the scarcity, right? So the sooner we start shifting our mindset around that kind of change, the better.
Yeah, it's a great point. My friend Mike Carroll, who you might know, has been on the podcast a couple of times, like you, talks about this phenomena of, when you've got 1 degree of separation from every person, resource, idea, innovation, that you need. What are we really talking about in terms of human ingenuity there, human skill set there? And I think that's when you see this huge value of sense making in terms of context. By the way, the other one that I'll add to what you're saying, when you refer to imagining, an ambient environment, is I think that's a critical concept, Frank, in terms of how we think about worker experiences going forward. How do we think, about how workers navigate, get their knowledge, collaborate, connect into the organization, and what experience, enables them to do that? I think the more that we think about that as, an ambient idea in terms of what organizations can offer people, and it is just in the fabric of, how I work, all the better. So big proponent of that idea.
And what's the ecosystem that enables that ambient learning, right? Is it
right.
traditional educational institutions? Is it the business themselves? Is it some form of all that stakeholders that come together to enable that ambient learning? I think that's this all goes. It's going to be an ecosystem when it's done. It's just a function of just how it comes together.
Yeah. And by definition, then, right, Frank, it's going to be porous walls in a very broad context necessarily. So that's the, outside in, inside out idea that's going to be pretty basic here. Frank, I could go on and on. I'm going to stop because I'll just keep adding to your good ideas.
Me too.
Frank, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your ideas with us. I know you're crazy busy, and it's really quite generous of you to stop in and talk to our folks. I know they'll really appreciate it. So thank you as always, and I'll say safe travels, and I hope you get home for the holidays, and let's get together for a holiday drink sometime.
Sounds like a plan, and always a pleasure.
Always love it. Thank you so much. Be safe. See you soon.
Bye.